So this report, which I can pass around, was written by my colleague, Colleen Luthra. At Results UK, we regularly produce these sorts of reports for our different issue areas. And our normal practice is we do these policy reports in order to influence the government, senior officials within the FCDO. And then we typically distribute them to our sector colleagues, and then we put it through to our all parliamentary group. So that's a coalition of MPs from all across the political spectrum who come together and they agree that global education is very important and we're going to pursue the government on this issue. And then our sector colleagues, they also distribute amongst their core champions as well. And that's typically how we advocate the government. And then through these policy reports, we then do a series of events in Parliament as well. So at the end of this month, we'll be launching this report in Parliament, and then we'll follow through with written and oral questions and so on. And then obviously we have the lovely grassroots team who support us, and they go out to their MPs, they do written, they do letters, and they do other advocacy facing with MPs as well. Okay, so our objectives for today's session, we're going to start with just explaining the basics of Results advocacy position on global education. We'll then go on to the importance of learning outcomes and why access to education isn't enough. And then we're going to do some capacity building for the political and policy outcomes of foundational literacy and numeracy. Okay, so why are we advocating on education anyway? First and foremost, education is a human right. So absolutely no exclusion for any child is right anywhere in this world. Irrespective of your geographic location, you should be afforded that opportunity to be able to learn. And then secondly, foundational learning is critical, which is the topic of our conversation today. So a good education will develop these critical skills, especially in basic numeracy and literacy. And that creates a gateway for children to progress on to further education, to build their more resilient communities, their own countries, their economies, and so on. And then education must promote sustainable development. So a good education develops every person's values and their capacity to live together in peace, to respect and appreciate human diversity, gender equality, and human rights. And then finally, which is probably a complete no-brainer, education requires investment. The financing of education is the most efficient and socially responsible investment any country can make. And every dollar invested in education yields a higher return for individuals and even more so for society. I missed this word. Yeah. So the learning crisis, over the last 30 years, we have had numerous interventions, programs, and financial pledges to increase the number of children in school. And that's been an incredible stride. At this point in time, there are more children physically in school than at any other point in human history we've had. 91% of the world's children are actually in school right now. Since 1995, the number of girls in education has risen by 180 million. But physically being in school doesn't actually mean you're learning. And the World Bank and UNESCO, they carried out an analysis in which they coined the term learning poverty. All children should be able to read by the age of 10. And reading is that gateway for learning as a child progresses through school. And conversely, the inability to be able to read slams that gate shut. And the meta-analysis highlighted that 9 in 10 children in low-income countries can't read by the age of 10. And the complete opposite is true. No, sorry. The exact inverse is true in high-income countries where 90% of children can read by the age of 10. So that just illustrates the level of the crisis that we're facing. And in numeracy, it's a very similar story. 387 million primary school children globally can't do basic maths. And that figure rises to 617 million if we account for secondary school children as well. So learning poverty has created the learning crisis. The learning crisis, it threatens countries' efforts to build human capital. And in its simplest form, human capital is the knowledge and skills an individual needs to possess to be able to contribute to their own country's economic output. And without foundational learning, students often fail to thrive throughout their schooling life because they haven't acquired those basic skills. And in low-income countries, we know that by that age, most children, if they haven't acquired those skills, they're losing their momentum. They're actually pulled out of school.
Yeah, if you could speak up a little bit.
Okay, sorry. Which table? This one. I don't know if it'll stretch because it's just there. So we can just go.
Yeah, that should just go over. Yeah. To interrupt, just I could hear the kids getting noisy. It's like
They're having a demo.
Why did we do this?
I've overcomplicated everything.
I literally don't know how to get across now. I do the learning process. Yeah. Okay, so Sustainable Development Goal 4, that aims to achieve inclusive and quality education for all children. But at the current rate that we're going, it will take about 40 years to achieve Sustainable Goal 4. So at this rate, in 2013, when that goal is supposed to be achieved, 43% of children will still be in learning poverty.
How much is that?
43%.
That's
Okay.
for all children.
Yeah. In low-income countries.
Okay, yeah.
So I should have said that. So this graph, it just shows how access to schooling has improved. It demonstrates the rate of progress, showing that the total number of out-of-school children dropped from 381 million children in 1998 to 263 million in 2014. Okay, so unsurprisingly, the pandemic had hugely detrimental effects to children and their foundational learning progress. So at the moment, research suggests that without effective remediation, which is basically catch-up classes at the right learning age for that child, and a 3-month gap will result in a year's worth of learning for a child. And across low-income countries, children, they were already in learning poverty. But the pandemic compounded all of those effects, and it's now resulted in 70% of children being in learning poverty. Pandemic-enforced school closures meant disruption to 1.6 billion learners across 190 countries. But recent research now has found that in a lot of low-income countries, those children have not gone back to school at all. Okay, so what is actually foundational learning? So like I mentioned in the previous slide, there is no one who says foundational learning isn't important. We know it is, because it's those important skills that children need to acquire. But the learning crisis at this moment in time is costing governments 129 billion per year globally. And it will cost this generation of students 17 trillion in their potential earnings, and that's 14% of global GDP. And if all people in low-income countries left school being able to read, it's estimated that 170 million people would be lifted out of poverty, which would equate to a 12% reduction in global poverty levels. But the benefits, they're not just economic. Foundational literacy and numeracy It builds more resilient, healthy, and equal societies. Highly literate and numerate communities, they're better equipped to respond to climate shocks and build healthy communities. Additionally, 2/3 of the world's illiterate are women. So this agenda would also reduce gender inequality. And although it can seem very dense, we're under no illusion that foundational literacy and numeracy won't solve all of the world's poverty issues. But the evidence is clear. It clearly makes a huge difference to people's lives, and it will make a substantial impact. So the UK and foundational literacy and numeracy. Although some would consider the UK a leading ODA granting government on foundational literacy and numeracy, it's more of a case of better of a bad bunch. Only US aid could be considered as having genuinely impactful approach. Research has identified just one UK funded basic education program, which improved foundational learning outcomes at scale compared to 6 from the US. And as many of you will know, the UK has been underfunding education, and year on year, that means an estimated 700,000 fewer girls will be in education as a direct result of underfunding. So ultimately, very little of what the UK is supporting is actually improving children's foundational learning at any notable scale or rate. This report that my colleague has written, it identifies key areas of weakness as a lack of data collection, lack of localized programs, uneven targeting and financing. So this program, Equip Tanzania, did basically everything that I just said was a weakness, but in a positive light. They did everything right in this program. So Equip Tanzania was a 6-year program funded by DFID between 2014 and 2020. The program set out to improve the quality of primary education and to improve pupil learning outcomes, especially for girls. The program, it focused on strengthening professional capacity and the performance of teachers and their school leadership. It's been one of the most successfully run programs. In fact, in a study carried out by Research Triangle Institute, the program was ranked in the top 10 worldwide. So what we essentially want is for the UK to run all of its education programs like this one. And this graph shows that had Equip-T programs continued, a similar trajectory of improvement would have been achieved. The positive effect on literacy skills would have continued to rise over the next 10 years. And then this next graph shows that the average cost per child would have actually decreased. And although it's just one example, it's illustrative of the value for money offered by sustaining investment in foundational learning. And further underlining that cost benefit potential is a program that was funded by the US called Read Kenya, and that supported 3 million children to read with fluency. And they managed to do so by spending just $27 per child. So what's been done about foundational literacy and numeracy and the learning crisis? So the Transforming Education Summit was held in September 2022, and it was convened in response to the global learning crisis. It was a key initiative of Our Common Agenda, which was convened by the Secretary General of the UN, with a view to elevating education to the top of the global political agenda, to create and to mobilize action, ambition, solidarity, and solutions to recover from pandemic-related learning loss. So in September, Results UK took a delegation to Transforming Education Summit. We took Preet Kaur and Imran Hussain. Preet, as some of you might know, is the Shadow Minister for Development, and Imran is Shadow Minister for Future of Work. And both MPs took part in a series of discussions regarding the learning crisis, the significance of foundational learning and mobilization. They also held several bilateral meetings with politicians from around the world, FCDO civil servants, and others alike. And in this picture, you can see they're with Alicia Herbertson and Gordon Brown. And at the Transforming Education Summit, the UK, they launched the Commitment to Action. And that's a push for all children to learn to read, do basic maths, and build their social emotional skills. At the moment, the Commitment to Action has been endorsed by Sierra Leone, Egypt, and Bulgaria. We spoke to the FCDO last week, and they were saying that they will continue to push on this agenda to ensure that all countries take on this challenge. Okay, so we're gonna end this first session by listening to this case study. So Gat is a former South Sudanese refugee. He moved to New York at the age of 15. Prior to that, he was living in a refugee camp. He has since become a top New York City lawyer, and he was recently named 40 under 40 to watch out for. And in this video, it's his story, and he reflects on how education changed his life.
Can you hear me? So I confirm.
Yes, we can hear you.
Amazing. Good afternoon, everyone, or late afternoon.
Get this out of the way.
Rather, I am delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure being in a virtual room with such amazing individuals fighting for one of the most important causes of this century. First and foremost, I would like to thank Lindsay again for having me here and then giving me the opportunity to share my story with you. And I hope that sharing my story with you will help you understand just a little bit more how important the work that you're here for is, the work you're doing is. So a little background. Again, my name is Gat Ramdeed, and I was born in a small town in South Sudan. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the map of Sudan or South Sudan, but a small town in South Sudan called Nasser. That's where my journey began. So my journey began then. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old, one day my brother and I were playing in the Nile River when a gunfight broke out near where we were playing. And for a moment, time froze for me. And I could see and hear everything that was going on around me at that moment. Soldiers were everywhere. People were screaming and running. Some were shot and fell and never got up again. And the bright and sunny day suddenly turned into complete darkness because the sun completely disappeared from all the smokes, from all the burning houses. But luckily, my brother and I got out of the river and we ran. And we continued to run until we could no longer hear the sounds of guns and screams. And a week later, we found ourselves in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, 150 miles away from our home, alone without our parents and without knowing the fate of our parents back home. The refugee camp gave me an opportunity. It gave me refuge, and it became my new home for the next 6 years before coming to the United States. And I came to the U.S. at the age of 15. I was about 15 years old when I came here. So when I started ninth grade in a place called Omaha, Nebraska, I don't know if many of you are familiar with Nebraska, but a place called Omaha, Nebraska. When I started ninth grade there, I didn't know how to read, write, and to make matters worse, I didn't speak English either. So after I graduated high school, 4 years later, I graduated high school and I got a scholarship to college. And I graduated college and I decided that I want to further my education. So I decided to go to law school. And so I studied and got into law school. And during law school, I got an internship at the United Nations headquarters here in New York City, where I got an opportunity to meet the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. I graduated law school in 2019, and I am now, as Lindsay said, I am now working in New York City. I'm in one of the best law firms here, and just this year, I was selected as one of the top attorneys here in New York City. And that's just, a short version of my background. I learned at a very young age that education was my only way out of my circumstances. And I was not going to let anything stand in my way. But like many children around the world, there were many obstacles to learning for me at the refugee camp. That's why I spent 6 years in the refugee camp without ever learning how to read or write. Education for me at the camp was simply just not a priority. And here's an example of why education was not a priority for me at the camp. While I was at the refugee camp, I must have been about 12 or 13 years old. One day, while I was at school, I felt very sick. I was sweaty, dizzy, and my stomach was growling for the entire class to hear. I was hungry. I felt so sick that I couldn't spend another minute in class, so I got up to go home. And on my way home, I was still very dizzy, and my vision was getting blurry, and then everything went dark. I passed out. I don't know how long I was out for, but then I heard a voice. I heard someone say, hey, are you okay? She helped me up, and I got home. I made it home. But a few weeks later, I passed out again. And when I passed out the second time, I knew that I had to do something. I knew my life was in danger. I knew this was a matter of life and death. I knew that I had to find a way to solve this problem. I had to find a way to make money in a refugee camp, or I wouldn't be able to continue going to school. I knew that if I didn't do something, all the dreams that I had would die with me. I was very certain of that. I remember thinking, I am a kid. I am in a refugee camp, and I had no parents with me. How could I possibly make money in this place? I wondered, and I wondered for days. Then I decided to do the job that even refugees didn't like doing for money. I went into the forest and gathered dried firewoods, brought them into the camp, and sold them. I did that every day for years until I came to the United States, and I made money. I solved that problem. Although making money and solving that problem, solving the problem of hunger, although I did that, it simultaneously created another problem. It took away from my study. I just didn't have enough time to do both. I didn't have enough time to go to school and work during the day. I just didn't. And that's why I spent 6 years at the refugee camp without ever knowing how to read or write. And I spent all of my time there surviving, just trying to survive. And that story is not unique at all. Many children at the camp that I was in, and many children around the world, are still making the same decision that I made years ago. They are choosing to work rather than go to school. And they will continue to do this until they go into their adulthood without ever realizing their dreams. Because education is just not a priority for them. They're simply surviving. And had I not come to the United States, where I had a better fighting chance through the education system here, I would have not been a lawyer, let alone being named a top 40 under 40 lawyer here in New York. That wouldn't have been possible. So in order for us to solve the education crisis. In order for us to give each and every child around the world an opportunity to learn, we must ensure that children are not forced to choose between education and survival. That's an essential part of the solution. And I think we can all agree on that. And I came here to tell you my story, and I came here to tell you that you must collaborate with each other and keep fighting each and every single day to ensure that children and children like I was get a fighting chance, especially now more than ever. You know, the COVID-19, we all know the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the insufficiencies and inequalities that were already there in our education system globally, not just in one country, globally. And now more than ever before, children are being left behind. A lot of them are falling behind from their studies because of the pandemic, on top of everything else that they are dealing with. And I came here to tell you to keep fighting, because there's just so much on the line. The future of our leaders of tomorrow is on the line, and the future of our educators, scientists, doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, it's all on the line. And it's our responsibility. It's our collective responsibility to ensure that the dreams of children everywhere is protected. It's our responsibility. And I am a result of what happened when we invest in education and proper education. I'm where I am today because of what each and every one of you is fighting for. And you, as educators and people who are fighting for education, you have the most important job in the world, and you must continue fighting to ensure that education is prioritized globally. You must help the world understand that investing in education is investing in our collective future. The world has to see that. It's our responsibility. And education can be a matter of life and death to the dreams of many people in our communities, especially those whose only hope of a better life is through education, people like I was.
Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, sorry, were you going to continue? I didn't want to cut you off.
That's all I have. Thank you.
We're going to do a little exercise now. And these are 2 questions. So what surprised you about the information, and how does that information make you feel? So for our next session, we're actually going to talk about the policy recommendations that are within that report. Okay, so policy recommendation 1 is focusing on bilateral education overseas aid spending on foundational learning. So action track 1 calls for the UK to better prioritize literacy and numeracy in its global education work, improve data collection for measurement of impact, and widen targeting of UK ODA for basic education. And we also want them to scale up ambition for UK financing to tackle the learning crisis. Policy recommendation 2. Action track 2. So the way that we have done this report is that we have 11 recommendations, and we've split it into 3 different action tracks. So in action track 1, there's 4 different recommendations. Action track 2, 4 recommendations, and then action track 3, we have 3 recommendations. And then action track 2 calls for the UK to prioritize support for teachers and education systems, so they are equipped to effectively teach reading, writing, and maths, collaborate with partner governments to improve education policy, and better integrate local actors and expertise. Okay, and then action track 3, it focuses on improving UK bilateral and multilateral engagement on foundational learning. There's an opportunity for the UK government to amplify its voice, calling for greater global ambition in addressing the learning crisis, holding multilateral organizations to account on their work to improve foundational skills, and encouraging other countries to follow suit Education cannot wait. Upcoming replenishment is a crucial opportunity for the UK to step up its financing to protect the foundational learning of children in emergencies and protracted crises. And that is our policy recommendations for the UK.